All right, welcome back. We are continuing on with Chapter 6 in Open Stax. Today we will be looking at fractures and healing. This will be a very short video. There's not a lot here, but still worth your time to look at some of this medical terminology. First of all, when bones are fractured, those fractures can vary from very minor, to very, very serious, and the repair time that it takes varies dramatically depending on what bone is injured and where it's injured and how badly it's injured. Um, and so this video is really only going to touch on the highlights of some of those processes. But in any event, let's put some of these things together. First, fractures may either result in the breaking of the skin, the tearing of the skin, and so that the bone actually projects outside of the body, and that those are often referred to as compound fractures. Here in the list, you'll see it's known as an open fracture. They also list compound, but open fractures are those in which the bone protrudes outside. Literally damages the skin, cuts the skin, and protrudes outside. So those are compound fractures. And then you've got closed or simple fractures, which occur completely internal. Just because they're simple, by the way, does not mean they are not traumatic. It does not mean they're not serious. It does not mean they're not life-threatening. So the only difference between a compound and a simple fracture has to do with whether it has damaged the skin or not, and whether there's a projection outside. So that's important to recognize. It doesn't mean anything about whether it's simple to fix or more difficult to fix or anything like that. So as you think about those two terms. Now, as we look at the terms at the top of this list, each of these may, in many cases, refer to either a simple or a compound fracture. So let's begin with a transverse fracture. A transverse fracture is one that occurs where the fracture itself is exactly straight across the long axis of the bone, which means it would be perfectly perpendicular to the long axis, basically making a clean break across the shaft of the bone, and so that would be called a transverse. Probably more often than not, those breaks don't occur perfectly straight across, and rather occur at some angle. And when the break occurs at an angle, it's referred to as oblique. So oblique fractures are those that occur at some angle relative to the perpendicular axis of the shaft of the bone. A spiral fracture occurs when a bone is twisted, and the twisting results in some form of fracture. Now that fracture may be across the entire bone. It may be only across part of the bone. But spiral basically means that a bone has been twisted in some form, and the result of it is segments of it have pulled apart from each other. That's called a spiral fracture. Um, and these sometimes can happen, for example, in a fall where you try to catch yourself with your hand. Sometimes the radius twists in such a way that you'll get a spiral fracture, and there's many other bones that can be broken in a spiral form as well. A the other kinds of fractures in the list here include the comminuted fractures, which these are very traumatic fractures, and this occurs when you get a break in the shaft, but the break is at such a high force that it leaves small pieces of the bone, or even sometimes large fragments of the bone, between the two longer pieces. This often happens when people fall from a long height, and the impact is at such a force that it will break the bone and actually fracture the bone into pieces. Not just not just a single simple fracture across, but a kind of a crushing force, which leaves fragments of the bone in between the two segments. So that's called comminuted fracture. An impacted fracture occurs from compression. And this happens when a bone is compressed in such a way that it breaks, and then one piece is forced up into the other piece. And as traumatic as that sounds, it is just that, quite traumatic, and those are difficult fractures to set from a doctor's standpoint. Finally, there is the Greenstick fracture. This is a fracture that only occurs on one side of the bone. So these are minor fractures that don't completely cross and separate a bone into two pieces, but rather just create a crack in the bone on one side or the other of a bone. So a Greenstick fracture. Now you can have, these could be, for example, you could describe a fracture as closed or simple. It could be a Greenstick fracture and also be spiral. So it's possible to have a spiral fracture that's Greenstick and would be described as simple. So I wanted you to point out that each fracture might carry more than one of these terms. Okay, well, let's take a look at how fractures heal naturally. I mean, you do know that doctors may be involved in setting the bone in such a way that it improves healing. That's really quite important, especially if you have something like a compound fracture where the bones just are not together. Those two things have to come back together at their ends to properly heal. So there is that piece. But once the two pieces are in alignment with one another, or as close to an alignment as you can get, the body will begin to heal itself. And these are the steps in that process. The first step is basically the formation of a hematoma. And the hematoma is just a clotting. And so what happens is, immediately once you get a break of a bone, the blood vessels either in the periosteum or even in the medullary cavity or surrounding tissues will begin to bleed into that tissue area. And it will fill the gap. In the fracture here, you can see an oblique fracture that's being filled with blood. Well, that blood will eventually clot. That usually happens pretty quickly, actually. It happens within, maybe just less than a day. You'll get a strong hematoma developing in a fracture, and then within an additional couple of days, what you will get is the formation of what is referred to as an internal callus and an external callus. So if you look there in illustration B, what you're seeing first or I'll show you first, is this external callus. The external callus is being formed by, or it's being formed of both bone. You're going to get bone to begin filling into this callus, and also hyaline cartilage. The hyaline cartilage is being deposited by chondrocytes that you will find within the periosteum. And the bone is being laid down by osteoblasts, obviously, which are also part of the internal cellular part of the periosteum. So they are immediately, within 2 to 3 days, have laid down a pretty decent surrounding kind of a collar to the fracture that extends from one end over to the other end and would ring the entire bone. It's called an external callus. It's pretty thin, and this external callus is again made of hyaline cartilage and some bone fragments within it. On the inside, in the end osteum, there are some chondrocytes that are found within the endosteum that lay down a fibrocartilage kind of internal callus. Now, the internal callus and the external callus will continue to grow until they meet one another. And as they're doing that, as they do that, the same kind of thing that happens during endochondral ossification. And I want you to harken back and remember that. That's where you'll get some of the chondrocytes that have secreted a substance around them and get further and further away from any nutrient. Because remember, in cartilage, there is no blood vessel serving it. And because of that, they fail to get nutrients through diffusion, and eventually will begin to die. And as they are dying, and they call it hypertrophy, they begin to secrete substances that actually calcify the cartilage around them. So that fibrocartilage begins to calcify, and in the exact same way we learned about an endochondral ossification, osteoblasts begin to replace that. The osteoclasts will resorb some of that, and osteoblasts begin to replace that calcified cartilage with bone. Now, the first bone that forms, you can even see it here in this picture really well, is a spongy type trabecular style bone. So here, these trabeculae, you can begin to see if you look closely at the picture. The repair is originally going to be a spongy bone format. But over the next couple of weeks, that spongy bone begins to slowly be replaced by osteoclasts and osteoblasts working together to form a compact bone in the place where it used to be. So the compact bone will replace along the core of the shaft of the bone. So, and the medullary cavity will return to normal because of the osteoclast clearing the remaining spongy bone out of the way. And the healed fracture, although sometimes it does leave, as you see here, kind of an expansion area where if you look at the bone, you can tell it was fractured. In some cases, depending on how small and clean the fracture was, it repairs in such a way that, even on close examination of an x-ray, you can't tell. So they can repair that nicely. They can remodel themselves into nearly perfect bones. So, okay, well, that covers section 6.5.